Perfect timing, Kat. Don't distract me. Hello, packages, parsers, and programs. What if AppSec ran aviation safety? Welcome to Flight ASW 365. The captain has turned on the password strength sign. Please ensure your password is securely fastened against the arbitrary list of requirements, as this flight is not equipped with passkeys. There are several emergency exits on this aircraft. Take a moment to locate the default exit, keeping in mind that it may be the furthest from you. If there is a loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will drop down. To start the flow of oxygen, pull the mask towards you and submit a breathing review request. In the unlikely event of a water landing, check beneath your seat for a list of top 10 swimming techniques. And so, this week, we talk with Bob Lord about the harms of security myths and how to counter them. Fasten your seatbelt and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Generative AI is powerful, but it comes with real risks, from prompt injection to data leakage misuse and agentic AI. The OWASP Gen AI Security Project unites a global community of expert practitioners who tackle these challenges every day. Together, they've built practical playbooks, adoption guides, and the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs, resources any team can apply right now to strengthen AI security. And it doesn't stop there. This is open source, built by practitioners, for practitioners, working together to secure generative AI. Visit securityweekly.com/OWASP to use the playbooks and join the effort to protect tomorrow's intelligence today. Ever feel like your network infrastructure is stuck in the past? Meet MITRE, the company reimagining what it means to get and stay online. MITRE delivers full-stack networking, wired, wireless, and cellular, all in one seamless, scalable, and secure solution. From hardware design and firmware to software deployment and support, MITRE streamlines every part of your network while giving you all the control and transparency you need. Whether you're managing a branch office, retail stores, or a massive data center, MITRE gives you performance, reliability, and the visibility you need to stay in control. Thanks to MITRE for sponsoring. Go to securityweekly.com/MITRE to book a demo now. That's securityweekly.com/MITRE, METER. This is episode 365, recorded January 12th, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and before I introduce Bob, one reminder for our Security Weekly listeners. You can save a whopping $100 off your RSAC 2026 All Access Pass. RSAC 2026 conference will take place this March 23rd through 26th right here in San Francisco. Come by and say hi. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC26 and use the code 56U5SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. Bob Lord is a cybersecurity executive and public interest technologist with deep experience building and defending high-profile digital systems. He has led major Secure by Design initiatives at the Institute for Security and Technology and at CISA, where he served as a senior technical advisor focused on shifting more responsibility for customer safety to software manufacturers. He was the first CISO at the Democratic National Committee, a CISO at Yahoo, and the first security hire at Twitter. And now he's here. Thank you, Bob. Hello, and thanks for joining us.
Hello. I'm very, very honored to be here. Mike, I'm a huge fan of yours, so it's just great to catch up.
Well, and as you might have, I gave, I think, a good nod to the work you've been doing in my intro about aviation safety and the term you've coined of Hacklore. And it's a little bit of folklore, as people can hopefully figure out, a little bit of hacking, and a lot of myths. But let's have you define what exactly is Hacklore and why should we be talking about it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the threads of this go back a whole bunch of years, and so these are the kinds of things that I had noticed uh, going back to Yahoo, and then I think mostly at the DNC, where I was trying to secure not just the DNC but all of the people who worked there, including their personal accounts, as well as the
Mm.
57 states, if you can believe it or not. There's a few extra states. There's 57 state organizations, and then of course all the campaigns. And one of the things that was really worrisome to me is I had come in 2018 after the 2016 hacks, and so I had to ask myself, how is it that most hacks happen, and how am I going to build a program that's going to allow people to be more secure and resist all of those kinds of attacks? So I looked around, and when I talked to people, they would ask me questions. They asked me questions like, "How can I secure myself in the cafe?" Or "What is it that I should do to select the best VPN?" And these were questions that were not really responsive to the ways that we saw hacking happen. And I understood why they were asking these questions, but they weren't really going to help them be more secure. And so I put together a security checklist, which is a nonpartisan, uh, really just a checklist of all the things that you should consider to improve your security posture. So that was back at the DNC. That's still available. It's a non-political organism, non-political document, and I still think it's pretty good. So, fast forward a few years, I continue to see more and more advice aimed at everyday people that is just
Mhm.
outdated and just often wrong. And like I said, I understand some of the reasons for that, because in the past, some of those bits of guidance were in fact true. There was a big germ of truth in some of them, but we need to go back and rethink the tactics that are going to stop today's most common crimes. And so I came up with this idea of giving it a label, and I came up with a whole bunch of different ones. The one that really stuck was Hacklore. So it's a combination, like you said, of hacking and urban legends or folklore. So I really wanted to give it a name so that we could talk about it, and that would help me distinguish between the good advice, which helps people, and the advice which just holds people back and wastes their time.
Yeah, and I think and I love that aspect of urban legends because there might be that germ of truth or a little bit of grain because I'll go ahead if we talk about public Wi-Fi at cafes. I'll invoke the secret incantations of poodle and beast and crime. And as AppSec insiders, I think you might immediately recognize I'm referring to all these SSL types of vulns.
Right.
But even if I say those, were those how people were hacked in the first place? Did you even see these happen?
Yeah, I've never seen anything like that. But going back a few years, so in 2010, I joined Twitter, and I think it was in 2010 when some researchers released a program, a plugin to Firefox called FireSheep, and some of your listeners probably remember that. And what was really slash fun. In retrospect, it was fun. At the time, it wasn't so fun. And so what happened is this plugin, if you installed this in your Firefox browser, and if you configured your laptop a certain way to basically be able to read all the packets on the network, you could go to a cafe and you could eavesdrop in on connections. And that's because almost every connection was over HTTP. When you logged in to a site, that name and password was sent over HTTPS, and so it was encrypted. But then almost every system would fall back to non-encrypted HTTP. Now, banks and shopping were, a mixed bag. Most banks got it right from the beginning, I think. But what you could do is not only eavesdrop in on what people were doing, so you could see which pages they were looking at on Facebook or what tweets they were reading on Twitter, but you could actually push a button and then become that person because the session cookies were sent in the clear.
Mhm.
And so that FireSheep experiment really created a sense of change and a sense of urgency in the minds of the people who ran those systems. So we all had programs to move everything towards HTTPS for all connections, but this change, this introduction of FireSheep, accelerated those efforts. So again, big germ of truth, but that was 2010, and since then we've had so much progress around operating system improvements around security and encryption, browsers, the introduction of Let's Encrypt, websites doing a far better job of securing their connections. So there's just been this huge change, but we haven't gone back to recalculate our advice, and so we still give advice that was appropriate in 2010, but is long past its expiration point. It is definitely moldy and should be retired.
Now, we're definitely going to tease a little bit about that aspect of Let's Encrypt, HTTPS by default, and get into that in a second. But let's not leave the 2010 quite yet. I like, my hat. I like this a little bit of time travel. I think part of your research, part of your advocacy also comes from a paper from around, 2007, from Steve Christie and MITRE about unforgivable vulnerabilities. And this was suggestions, recommendations that maybe haven't changed in almost 20 years. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, that's a really good callback. So some advice has gotten stale, but also some things we haven't made as much progress on. And so, as you mentioned, MITRE had produced a paper in 2007 called Unforgivable Vulnerabilities. And if you know the MITRE people, they're amazing, wonderful people, but they're not prone to making clickbait headlines. And so when it says the word unforgivable, in my head, I think how many layers of meetings and approvals did they have to go through where they, pulled out the thesaurus and said, like, no, this is actually the English word that means the thing that we're trying to say. And so they said, look, it's 2007, and year after year, we keep seeing certain classes of coding error that we just don't think should exist. And they shouldn't exist because we have effective mitigations that have been widely known for years, and so we really just don't think software writers should be falling victim to these kinds of coding errors. And so what did those include? Well, I encourage everybody to go read the paper if you haven't. If you have read it, go read it again because it's still kind of evergreen. So cross-site scripting, SQL injection, command injection, directory traversal, classic buffer overflows, things like that. So you go fast forward in your time machine to 2025, MITRE produces, I think it's about an annual report on the most dangerous weaknesses. And what do you see at the top of the list? Well, SQL injection, cross-site scripting. It's the classic unforgivable vulnerabilities. So we've made progress on a few of those. If you go back and look at the list, you'll see that there's been some progress from the 2007 paper. But really, what we're seeing is that the industry as a whole has not been able to eradicate these unforgivable vulnerabilities. Some vendors, some open source maintainers have done a fabulous job, and they just do not have those problems. But because we're humans, we don't really see where the progress is because it's hard to see the absence of something. But anyway, so I think it's important to go back in time and say, are we making progress on this? And in some cases, the answer is yes, but in many cases, no. And we should ask ourselves why.
And part of we should ask ourselves why. And one of the things I'm reading through a lot of your work, I also want to ask myself who, in the sense of who is the audience here? Because stopping Hacklore, you're saying, we, I think as an industry, hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth, are giving users misleading or outdated advice. But there's also that sense of, I think you're teasing out, how did that advice come around in the first place, or why are we not updating it? So maybe tell us a little bit about who the Hacklore is for, in the sense of what kind of results, what kind of outcomes you'd love to see from it.
So it's a really good question because I think sometimes people get a little confused. We're talking about the guidance that is aimed at everyday people. And so these are your friends and the family who are not in the business. There are also high value targets, which is separate. So if you are a government official, if you are a human rights activist, if you're a reporter doing national security reporting from troubled parts of the world, there's different advice that you should follow. But what we're really talking about is the advice that goes to everyday people to stop the most common classes of attack. And you're hitting on something very important, which is, you're probably going to talk about threat modeling in a minute, but it really comes back to understanding who that audience is and figuring out what is the problem that they have, who are the villains who are going to be attacking them, what sort of technologies do they use, what does the threat landscape look like versus the technology landscape, and let's compute with fresh eyes the kinds of things that the everyday person should do to avoid the most common attacks. And this, of course, is different from other kinds of advice. So if you think about the world of application security, it's also important to understand who is the attacker and who might be victimized and how might they be victimized. And it's all of these things, the common thread between these ideas is really just thinking a little bit more deeply than I think we see in the headlines as we see in social media, and trying to tease out answers to questions like, why haven't we eliminated all the unforgivable vulnerabilities? Why do we tell people to avoid banking on a public Wi-Fi? We should have answers for these questions. And in some cases, we're going to have to make course corrections.
In some of those course corrections, I think very much tease out work you and some others did at CISA on the big movement for secure by design, secure by default, to two phrases that seem very easy and obvious, yet perhaps are not so when developing software. And I think that secure by design, to walk through that a little bit, is that idea of you called that before about public Wi-Fi. Right now, your operating systems, your browsers are opportunistically trying to update any connection to HTTPS. So even that's that type of thing that even if the website, for whatever reason, has a HTTP link somewhere in there, the browser is going to say, you know what, we think HTTPS is just better overall. Let's use it. And hopefully there's something, that's maybe one part of design in a nutshell, but I've obviously glossed over the threat modeling, other aspects. What are some ways to start thinking about what secure by design means from a software developer perspective?
Yeah, so a few things. One is we knew that we wanted to really try to, I want to say kickstart, but that's not true, because there have been people who have been advocating for secure software design for 50 years, and in the context of the world that we know, certainly for a quarter of a century or more. And so there are people who have been on the right side of history. Some of them are kind of burnt out and frankly, worked on other things because they just weren't able to see the kind of adoption that we wanted. So we wanted to say, why do we have these unforgivable vulnerabilities? There are so many great resources for developers to go and build safer software. We don't know how to build safe software. I think everybody knows that. But we know how to build much safer software. And so the question we asked ourselves is why? And what is our novel contribution going to be to this? Maybe it's an overcrowded space. I mean, you tell me. You're the expert. But there's a lot of very, very good advice there. And so what we did is we stepped back and we said, well, what is it that we can learn from outside the world of software? It is entirely possible that the ideas that have gotten us into this problem, the habits, the momentum, the incentives that got us into this problem are not the ones that get us out. So we take a lot of inspiration from other sectors: planes, trains, automobiles, medical safety, food safety. And we ask ourselves, what is it that they have done to dramatically improve the safety for not just their direct customers, but for the public at large? And so we look at things like Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed book that came out in 1965, where he really described the automotive industry as one as pitching their products for things like lifestyle, the features. People wanted their cars to look like art. And so there was just a lot of stuff going into the marketing and sales of those automobiles in the post-war era. But safety wasn't one of those. And so part of that was the consumers didn't know how to ask for safety. They didn't even know to ask for safety. They didn't know that the likelihood of you being in an accident and the impact on your body, the physical impact on your body, was directly related to the design and manufacturing of the car. This was a novel concept back then. So what we wanted to do is go back and take a look at both that, but also the history of quality by design. So this guy, Joseph Juran, wrote a book called Quality Design. He wrote many books. He was one of these guys after World War II who went to Japan to help with the reconstruction. And long story short, there's a reason why we don't make TVs in America anymore and a bunch of other stuff like that, because they really took his lessons to heart. And he has a lot to teach us about what quality looks like. So the output of this was really three core principles. One core principle is that we want the software manufacturers to take ownership of their customers' security outcomes. So, a trivial example of this is don't just update your code and throw it over the transom and say, okay, good luck figuring out when you have a maintenance window to update your edge routers or whatever the product is. We really want you to start to think more deeply about how the customers can be harmed and ways to take them out of harm's way. Another thing is we want organizations to think about radical transparency. If you think about, we all know stories of companies that have withheld CVE records because it was discovered internally. But we think that radical transparency is going to help the customers and the public at large, as well as the organization, establish real credibility that they're not trying to hide anything. And everybody I've talked to who can point to examples, good and bad examples, like people are like, yeah, this was a bad thing they had, but they exposed it. They didn't have to. I have a better feeling about their SDLC than I do about these other companies that have not done that. So anyway, that was the second one, radical transparency. And then the third, and this really goes back to Duran, it's about organizational structure and incentives. And what he says is that you need to lead from the top. You cannot, in the same way that you cannot inspect quality into a product, you cannot delegate quality to the quality team. That's not how organizations have historically, manufacturing facilities have improved quality of their products. They've done that because of the personal ownership of a senior business leader. And the senior business leader has the ability to pull people from lots of departments to achieve a goal of improving quality. The quality team does not. And so I think we see these recurring themes over and over again where we have somehow said, hey, we hired an AppSec guy, we bought them some tools, it should be good enough. And going back to the first core principle of taking ownership of customer security outcomes, they don't connect the dots there. So really those were the things that we wanted to push on more than anything else. And I hope, love feedback from your audience about ways that works or doesn't work, but also examples would be super helpful. But anyway, that was where we were thinking about our contribution to the space.
Yeah, I love those principles because it's very easy just to say, to recognize that security is a component of quality, to match the third point you were just making just now. And that first one, I always get worried about, users should be demanding more security. Users should be demanding more safety, because that shouldn't imply that now all the users need to become experts on quantum cryptography and, this Lattice framework is now defensible against this. But that's absolutely not what you're saying. And that's why the focus is on software creators taking that responsibility. And I want to then, as I'm summarizing the points, just kind of helping that for the audience. The second one, transparency. We've highlighted even on this show, some postmortems in the sense of, rather than that lovely phrase, we take your security seriously, we like those blog posts that say something bad happened. Here's what happened, to a degree of detail that, to be fair, lawyers are going to approve. But also here's what we're going to do about it. And that what we're going to do about it says a change to like an SDLC. It's not just we patched this and we moved on. It's we've changed our behaviors. And that feels like we need more of, because I want to ask you there on that, especially on that transparency point, that second part, how do we figure out where the crashes are happening? Because I want to offer up, can we just look at all the CVE records that are getting posted? If we have, 40,000 CVEs in a year, is that just showing us how things are being hacked? And that's where we should be worried about?
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time on the CVE program. So I'm a member of two working groups, and I started a third, which is the consumer working group. And so there's a lot of really interesting and great stuff that's happening. But one of the things that I noticed was that in conversations in the working groups and in other places, people had a bias towards talking about the upstream producers of CVE records, the CNAs, what they can and cannot do, and their constraints. And all that's very valid. What we were missing was the downstream consequences. So how are people ingesting this? And first order customers could include the open source and commercial tools that ingest all the CVE records to help defenders defend. And then, of course, the second order customers are those who are the defenders trying to figure out, okay, there's so many defects, there's so many security bugs. I can't I can't update them all. So I have to choose a strategy. And so I have to go buy a tool or find an open source tool to help me, or heaven forbid, try to use a spreadsheet, because that's 40,000. That's just not gonna be a good strategy. So we really wanted to do that. So in terms of the transparency, here's what happens in other sectors. And you'll hear me do this over and over again. Other sectors, there's a common set of patterns. They all do things very differently, and there's good, bad, and the ugly for all of those. But one of the things that we see as a common theme is the government has a database of defects, and manufacturers are compelled to reveal those defects. Another is incident database. So when things go wrong, they collect information and they make that public also. And then the third is they do crash tests. And so NHTSA is an organization that does crash tests. The ones, if you go on the internet and look for car crashes or car crash tests, you'll actually find IIHS, which is an insurance organization. And so they do the more glamorous smash ups, but the government does the same thing. So we don't have this, where we don't have the obligation for commercial companies that sell products in a country to produce CVE records that are at all. So there's no obligation. So there are plenty of commercial software companies that do not publish their own CVE records. That doesn't seem right to me. And we also haven't not yet established a pattern of quality of CVE records. And so I'm on the quality working group, and again, the consumer working group is helping us think, what are the downstream implications of this? But in my mind, quality of CVE records are three things. It's completeness, accuracy, and timeliness. And if you have all three of those, you have something fairly substantial that the downstream customers can use. So anyway, we lack the basic infrastructure. So just looking at the number of CVE records is not useful. It is potentially more useful to look at the CWE, which is the class of coding error. So that might be a more interesting thing to look at. But I caution people to not look at a company that has a lot of CVE records and conclude that they don't have a good SDLC. It may well be the case that they have a very good SDLC and that they're very transparent.
And transparency.
And so the raw counts are a very, very unhelpful thing to look at.
Zero trust is clearly the future as threats get faster, quieter, and harder to detect. But implementing it shouldn't disrupt the business. ThreatLocker enforces default deny at execution in a way that remains enterprise-ready, scalable, and operationally clean. Unknown software is stopped cold, trusted apps stay contained, and drift is locked down across the environment. It's zero trust that works in real enterprises and prepares you for the threats ahead. See why CISOs are adopting it at securityweekly.com/threatlocker.
That's a wonderful point too, because it's the last thing I would offer up is we as an industry should be advocating for transparency and then making fun and saying, wow, you are the worst SaaS, worst vendor, worst operating system, et cetera, just because of some very superficial defect count, as opposed to kind of that incident database, as you were defining those parallels with the automotive industry. So then, if we do talk about CWEs, bit of perhaps a helpful leading question. If we were focused on CWEs, how does that start? How would you use a CWE to inform an AppSec program, for example, or a secure by design effort?
Right. So let's suppose a world in which open source organizations, they do a great job of issuing those, and commercial companies, let's imagine a world where they do a great job of that, maybe because they're compelled to do that. We'll see. That's not likely to happen anytime soon. So, and let's assume that they're complete and accurate and timely, so that you have great, thoughtful CWEs that are created. And just a little side note here, if you go take a look at a lot of them, they'll say things like CWE 20, which is a useless CWE for most cases. And there'll be a bunch that you'll see on a regular basis. And if you go look them up, the first word in all red and bold will say prohibited. And yet some organization has decided to issue a CWE there. But let's assume that they're complete and they're accurate. There are a few ways that we can mine this data, and I'm sure that real data scientists could tell you 5 more. But the two easy ones are across the ecosystem. Where are we having problems? how can we distinguish between the organizations that make software that simply have not invested the time, they've not prioritized certain kinds of things. So if we see chronic SQL injection over and over again, year after year, cross-site scripting, year over year, we say like, I think that may be your SDLC. I think maybe there's something there. If you take a look at other classes of vulnerability, like use after free, like, oh boy, okay, that's kind of a head scratcher. That's not on the unforgivable list. Like, oh boy, it turns out no matter who you are, how smart you are, how long you've been coding in C and C++, you're going to have certain classes of memory error. In fact, the numbers say about 70% of your vulns are going to be different kinds of memory safety. So those are industry-wide problems, and we need to be able to distinguish between the individual projects or products that are having certain kinds of problems versus things where we need to say, hey, this is a societal problem. We need to come up with a solution to memory safety that does not just rely on yelling at developers to be omniscient. Like that, we just know that that's not the case. So I think those are some of the things that we can do if we had enough of the right data.
Yeah, and I think one of the aspects of the unforgivable vulnerabilities was also that paper laid out what does it mean to be unforgivable, and it's not necessarily just we still see it all the time, but it does talk about precedents, meaning that we're aware of it. Talks about, has this been documented? Do we know how to solve it, or at least do we know good patterns to use? Is it obvious to see, or is it obvious to attack? And I think that is a very easy thing to apply to SQL injection and cross-site scripting. A little bit harder, as you pointed out, with something like use after free or other memory safety. But CISA, to go back to them, and others have been adopting, like saying, use Go, use Rust. And we see examples, positive examples from Android and Chrome saying, hey, look, we've started to adopt Rust, and things have been getting better. So if we point to that, what are some good takeaways from that? Because I'm going to offer up a bad takeaway is we should rewrite everything in Rust. I suspect that might not happen.
Probably not.
But I don't know. Maybe I'm not optimistic enough.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right that we should be pointing to the successes, and there have just been a lot of successes in memory safety. And so we've seen, if you haven't read the FRAC article from 1996, I think it's November of 1996, called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It is a fantastic paper. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary, and so I'm hoping that we can have a party or something. Maybe somebody will bake a cake or make cookies. But I'm very optimistic because we've seen just a tremendous amount of both research but also practical work in that space. So you mentioned the Android work to migrate things to Rust. Rust is now in the Linux kernel. It is now in the Microsoft kernel. There are memory tagging extensions used in various platforms. The latest version of the iPhone has some additional hardware capabilities. They have not been able to rewrite everything in Swift, which of course will probably never happen, but they have now a portfolio approach. So I think we can draw some inspiration from that. But you can also take a look at slightly simpler examples. The Google Secure by Design paper. And by the way, this is funny because you can actually, I haven't checked this today, but normally you can just go to Google and type Google Secure by Design, and you think you will get nothing but garbage because those are just like generic words. And it turns out, back when I've done this before, the Secure by Design paper is actually the first hit. So you can go find that. That paper is very interesting because it does a little bit of a humble brag, which is, hey, you may have noticed we don't have cross-site scripting problems at Google anymore. And there's a reason for that. And then they lay out some of the ways that they build their developer ecosystem. And the way that they build, I forget their term versus Microsoft. So there's this paved roads, paved paths. You get the idea. So these concepts are very interesting. And it causes me to wonder how we can give more of the spotlight to the people who've been doing developer experience work for a long time, so that you make the path of least resistance for the developer the one that is going to make them most productive while being the most secure. I think that there's been a community of people who have been working on this for a long time. And when I talk to a lot of even seasoned developers, they may not really be familiar with that space. So I think there are people who have been doing this for a while. We need to give them the spotlight.
And I like that you use cross-site scripting there at the end as an example, because cross-site scripting or my favorite path traversal, directory traversal, neither of those are memory safety issues. So it's not like we can just rewrite everything into Rust and then
That's right.
suddenly we're in a happy world.
That's right.
But you also mentioned there at the end the developer experience, and part of your 3 criteria, number 3 was kind of talking about incentives and org incentives. And I want to touch on that because even going back to Hacklore, there's very much the human condition at work here. It's fun to show off that I know I can reference Poodle and Beast and those fun OpenSSL types of research, or mention quantum cryptography, or all these things that might break it, and I can throw a bunch of words together and sound cool, but that's a very human thing. And incentives, we've seen also too, I think very luckily, a pushback against the idea that developers don't care about security. But you're saying, I think, developers need to be more responsible for security, or at least orgs do. How do we turn those incentives? Because that's not necessarily palatable or the first thing they're even worried about as an org, for example.
Yeah. So this is really at the core of the secure by design philosophy. We don't think that yelling at developers is a strategy. It hasn't been. If that was going to work,
What if I yell louder, Bob?
Yeah, exactly. And so part of it is that the organization needs to prioritize. I was going to say care, but that sounds too dismissive. Organizations, the overall external incentive structure is one that does not lend itself to software getting safer over time. And one example is we have product liability laws in the United States. So if you're injured by a product that you've purchased, you may be, if you can demonstrate that this was a design defect or a manufacturing defect, you might be able to hold them accountable in some way. You can get your money back, or extreme case sue, or if a lot of people have the same problem, you can have a class action lawsuit. We don't have that in software. That you can't do that to a software company. You've licensed the software, you have not purchased the software, and you have agreed to the end user license agreement, which does not allow you to do all sorts of things, including reverse engineering for security and a bunch of other things like that. So we don't have those external incentives. A recent Gartner paper that I saw had said that security was the second most important thing for buyers. I thought, really? That's not true. So I went and read it. What do they think security is? Good backups, HTTPS, and encryption in transit and at rest, and a few other things like that. Like, hey, I love all of those things. Those are great things. But nowhere did they get close to talking about the safety of the product and bad defaults, and none of that was part of that. So we just don't really think about that. And so if you don't have the external incentives, you're not going to have the internal incentives. And so that's where it comes back to. You just can't yell at the developers to stop coding bad. You've given them tools and processes and incentives that must necessarily yield the quality that we have today through no fault of their own. And so that third secure by design principle of lead from the top, that's what we're talking about. This has to be a mandate, an explicit mandate, not one that's implicit, one that you say, I'm going to, as the senior business leader, I'm going to be devoting a certain percentage of my resources to making the product better for my customers so that they're less likely to be compromised. That's where that comes from. And so developers have repeatedly told me, I talked to one senior developer, he said, Bob, you didn't invent any of the secure by design stuff. Everything that you've been promoting, we have a PowerPoint deck that has been gathering virtual dust for years. We've shown it to the executives, and they just don't want to allow us the time and the freedom to go make some relatively small changes that would have outsized improvements for the safety for our customers. They just don't have that. So I'm not going to solve the whole incentives problem probably ever, but
we got a couple more minutes. Keep going.
if we can acknowledge that this is really where the problems come from, we can maybe think a lot less about holding the individual developers accountable and start thinking about the systems that have created the world that we're in. So if you're a developer, hang tough. I think we're going to make some progress, but we really need everybody to help participate and share the Secure by Design white paper from CISA.
Now, speaking of the world we're within, let's narrow it a bit to just talk about the IoT angle. And I'm bringing that up because there have been pushes within the US, within the EU about regulating IoT or at least putting requirements around it. Also mentioned, I think it's the FCC's cyber mark. That's sort of that ingredient list of what's in a consumer IoT device. Do you see that as a positive direction in terms of like that transparency aspect or that accountability / responsibility? Is there a model there to build on?
Things like the trust mark are a good step forward, but they're voluntary and in some ways made possible by the participation of the companies that are affected. And so that's different than having an external regulator say, here's the baseline based on everything that we've heard, and you must adhere to this. Nevertheless, I'll take what I can get. And so I think those are a good step forward. But they're not going to be sufficient. What are the penalties for an organization that says that they're going to do something and then they don't? Well, there might be some, so that'll be interesting, but maybe not as much as real product liability reform. So all good stuff, but again, if you step back and say, what are the collection of incentives that have created the world today? We should be trying to figure out which of those can start to change the outcomes by changing some of those incentives. So I love all the work in the space, don't get me wrong, but until we step back and really start figuring out what is the systems level problem, we're not going to be able to get systems level solutions.
So with all the work going on in this space, you've also mentioned, the CVE working groups you're participating in. Obviously, CISA is still pushing on secure by design, secure by default. What are some ways you would offer up or, highlight for people that want to participate, either help with this work, either within CVE, within these broader types of pushes, or just more locally focused, if you will, within their own organization? What's maybe one or two steps you'd offer up or love them to take?
So a few things. We love more people to help with the CVE program. And so if you want to go take a look at the list of working groups and join one of those, that's great. Like I said, I have a personal fondness for the consumer working group, which I started. So feel free to join that and help us understand how people really consume CVE records and how they make decisions based on those. And so that could be because you ingest it automatically through some sort of code, or because you're the IT person who's trying to figure out, how do I patch all of these things? Like, why am I going to get in trouble if I can't figure out of these 19 different things I have to patch this week, which ones I can actually patch? Why am I in trouble? And so the other thing is being curious about the customers is potentially going to give you internal ammunition. In the white paper, we talk about field studies, and this is something that you'll find a great deal of expertise in around product features. So your product managers are going to be very good at understanding the ways in which the customers use or don't use certain features, how they solve certain problems. What we're not as good at is using those same investigative field study tactics to figure out, how are these security features used or not used? Are they helping degrade the attacker's ability to do their job, or are they not? And so there are ways in which we can do some simple things. After we started doing a lot of the secure by design work at CISA, we talked to one edge networking company who, they didn't say this explicitly, but it became clear that they had never measured the adoption of the security fixes amongst their customers. And so when they started doing that, they had some very interesting insights. Like, we're not going to tell them what those insights are going to be. You have to look at the data. But once they did that, they found the trajectory, the slope of the adoption curve. And they said, you know what? I think for certain classes of our products, we can turn on auto update. We'll just turn it on. And lo and behold, the next one just shot up in just a few days. Great. But then the next one, it fell off. People were turning off auto update. Why? I don't know. I need to check in with them. But once you start to get the data, once you're doing field studies, either by interviewing people like humans or getting telemetry, you're going to find all sorts of wacky stuff. And what you do with that is the important part. So getting curious about what actually happens in the customer site is probably the second thing I'd mention.
I love the wacky stuff is going to go onto our AppSec t-shirt slogan list. I love that aspect. And there's definitely been a theme. I want to call out attention to another underlying theme we've been referring to, and that's that aspect of data. Because it seems like, I'm going to be slightly not sarcastic, sincere here. You seem like you want to make decisions based on data, Bob. Why is that?
I didn't make this up. People have been talking about this for a long time. They just kind of beat it into me. So the world of software security is a world unburdened by data. And so going back to the Hacklore thing, that's partly why we have these myths, is because the myths sound like they give us insight and can help direct our behavior. That's not as good as having data that can tell you, no, it turns out those things are no longer true if they were ever true, and you should be doing this other thing. It's so boring to say, hey, you should have MFA, you should have strong passwords, a password manager, and update your stuff. That's the same stuff that we've been telling people for literally a decade, and it's not as sexy. So being able to overcome that, people make their decisions based on either stories or stats. And so what we have is a bunch of stories that have no pushback because we haven't done a good job of getting the stats. So when I talk about the field studies, that's a great example of being able to replace your intuition with something that will probably be confusing, confounding, and vexing, and in some cases infuriating. What do you mean they turned off this auto update? What, do they want to get hacked? Well, okay, why don't you call them and ask them? You get when you get the data, you get the ability to start making better decisions. And like I said, in my experience, when you get the data, it's never, the things that you've been arguing about in the meetings are not the things that are wrong in the field. And so getting the data just cuts through all of that and gets rid of the opinion. So that's been my experience, and I'm sure that's the experience of many people in your audience.
And it's got to be, it's not necessarily complex to go out and talk to your users. And those users could be your external consumers. They could be your internal developers as well. Those are, we can call it DX, we can call it UX. But I think that if there was one thing that I would pull out of this conversation for me, it would be go talk to people and see what they're actually concerned about, and then start working from there. And one of the things that they shouldn't be concerned about are these myths. So as we start to wrap up here, I do have to, only in January, it's the beginning of 2026. At the end of the year, what would be one of the myths that you would love to be able to put a little strike through into your list of Hacklore that no one is talking about anymore?
From our open letter, or other ones that are not on the open?
Which other? Yeah, whether it's one that's public up there, or just one that's a pet peeve of yours.
Well, I mean, for me, the one that really generates the most eye rolling is the banking on public Wi-Fi. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That actually, so I used to work at Netscape. So just to date myself, so I used to run the core cryptography library team at Netscape, and back then. I don't have any records to back this up, but the banks had SSL turned on for everything from the very beginning. And that's literally never been a problem. With online shopping, used to be a problem. With other sites, used to be a problem, not a problem anymore. And so I tap my home network because that's how I spend my time. And so I know which devices, my home routers, and I can see all the traffic, and I can figure this out. But my phone and my laptop, there's almost never any HTTP traffic. It is so rare. And it is usually when I go visit a website that was orphaned in 2005. That's really what that comes down to. There's still room for improvement. Don't get me wrong. We're still leaking DNS information. There's still TLS certificate exchanges, and the domain names and the certificates. There's all sorts of things that we still need to work on, but that's not how people are getting hacked.
No, and I think, and I want to offer up, again, here's my assertion, ungrounded in data after this good conversation with you about relying on data, but I want to say PCI was probably more responsible for getting TLS adoption than any black hat presentation or secure AppSec top 10 list. And especially with the explosion of Let's Encrypt, which you mentioned way back at the beginning. I didn't want to forget that because Let's Encrypt did two great things. It made certificates free, no cost, so there's no budget there. It also it lowered the cost of managing them. So not only free to get the cert, but free to actually operate and interact so that we could actually say, what if we had a world where certs rotated every 90 days or, even had shorter light times in the single digits? So I want to highlight those things as positive examples of where wins. Secure by Design can help us.
Big wins. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that.
So one of the other things, before we let you go, where can people learn more about Hacklore or more about some of the work you're doing? What are some things they can find out about you in 2026?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I don't really have anything to plug per se, other than hacklore.org, which is where you can go read that open letter. And feel free to send feedback, subscribe to the newsletter. We already have 500 people sign up for this thing, which is complete. I mean, it's just astonishing to me. We've really hit a nerve with people. So please feel free to send feedback. And for the other Secure by Design stuff, I mean, you can follow me on LinkedIn and some of the other social networks like Blue Sky and Mastodon. So I'll keep everybody posted. And the main thing though is if people in the audience were to be able to push in some way, whether it's pushing the hacklore.org website or it's trying to figure out how to implement some of the Secure by Design core principles within your organization. If we got just a little bit of movement in those spaces, I'm totally convinced that the power of subtle movement is absolutely possible, and so hopefully we'll be able to change some of the incentive structures, just a little bit here and there, a little bit here and there, and so I'm an optimist.
I'm glad you're an optimist, and it's a wonderful call for participation within the community. And I think it has some clear goals to attain here. And also point out, call for participation. That's 3 words. And one of the things we always ask our guests at the end is to describe AppSec in 3 words. And I'm really curious how you would approach this, Bob.
Okay, so I have 3 words that are not a sentence, if that's okay. So I'll say one is quality. So we talked about the quality working group and Joseph Duran. Please go look up Joseph Duran and his obsession with quality. So that's one. I think accountability is another. So we talked about the taking ownership of customer security outcomes. That's all about accountability and making sure that you're building the right features, but you're also not putting people in harm's way. The third is resilience, which really acknowledges the fact that bad things happen, both bad guys doing things to you, but also, stuff happens. So those are really the 3. So quality, accountability, and resilience are the ones that I really gravitate towards. I don't know if that's the correct answer or not, but you tell me.
All the answers are correct answers. I love it. And even though lots of bad things happen, good things happen, like you joining us for this conversation. I really appreciate it. I want to say thank you very much, Bob. This was really fun to go through.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank everyone else for joining us. Please, speaking of subscribing, please do remember to subscribe. Check out the show notes. We'll put in some links there. We'll also throw in, I have some extra links for some podcasts that Bob and I talked about too, as prior to this. Share about us on the socials. And speaking of perhaps IoT devices, check out Long Way Home by Neon Knox and Shades of Thunder. Listen to kick off your year with some new synthwave. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.